Join us on Patreon and become part of our journey to uncover history's untold stories. Your support helps us create in-depth content, bring hidden narratives to life, and keep history alive for everyone.
The story of medicine is often told as a tale of discovery, innovation, and progress, where Western science marches forward, unraveling nature's mysteries and saving humanity from disease. But behind this carefully constructed narrative lies another, often neglected truth. Many of the so-called discoveries celebrated in European history were already known, cultivated, and practiced for centuries, if not millennia, by non-European peoples. Few examples illustrate this erasure as vividly as the story of the plant that cured malaria long before Europe claimed to have found it. To truly grasp this forgotten history, one must imagine the world before the colonial age, when the spread of malaria shaped the rise and fall of empires. Malaria, a disease caused by parasites transmitted through the bites of female Anopheles mosquitoes, haunted the tropical and subtropical world. It determined where people could live, where armies could march, and whether plantations could survive. The disease devastated populations, draining strength and shortening lives. Entire regions became uninhabitable, and wars were often won or lost not by swords or cannons, but by the silent devastation of fever. Yet while Europeans struggled to endure malaria during their early encounters in Africa, Asia, and the Americas, local peoples had already developed knowledge to counter it. They understood plants, roots, and bark that eased fevers, reduced chills, and saved lives. This was no accident. It was the fruit of centuries of observation, oral transmission, and sacred knowledge tied to the natural world. And yet, when Europe encountered these remedies, they rarely credited the people who first cultivated them. Instead, they appropriated, renamed, and enshrined these medicines in European medical literature as if they were new. The most famous example is the quinine-rich bark of the cinchona tree from the Andes. For centuries, indigenous Quechua and Aymara communities in present-day Peru and Bolivia used the bark to treat fevers. They knew which trees held the healing properties, how to prepare the bark properly, and when to use it. The tree was sacred in their cultural worldview, bound to rituals of respect for the spirits of the land. It was not a casual folk remedy, but a refined, codified system of knowledge embedded in their cosmology. European awareness of cinchona is often traced to the early 17th century, when Jesuit missionaries supposedly discovered its medicinal qualities and brought it back to Europe. One widely circulated story tells of the Countess of Chinchon, the wife of a Spanish viceroy in Peru, who was allegedly cured of malaria with the bark in the 1630s. Whether true or not, the tale became a foundational myth of European medicine, giving the tree its Europeanized name cinchona after the countess, rather than after the Andean people who had cultivated its use for generations. This act of naming was itself an erasure, a way of rewriting history to remove the indigenous origin of the cure. By the late 17th century, quinine had become one of Europe's most prized drugs. It transformed the fight against malaria across the continent, saving countless lives and enabling further colonial expansion into Africa and Asia. Without quinine, European settlement in many tropical regions would have been nearly impossible. The British, French, Dutch, and Portuguese all carried supplies of Jesuits' bark, as it was sometimes called, in their military and naval expeditions. In this sense, quinine was not just medicine, it was a weapon of empire. Yet few paused to reflect that their empires had been made possible by the botanical knowledge of the very peoples they sought to conquer. But the Andean cinchona tree was not the only plant that cured malaria long before European science gave it recognition. Across the world, in China, another equally remarkable remedy existed. For over 2,000 years, Chinese medical texts described the use of qinghao or sweet wormwood, Artemisia annua, for treating fevers. The earliest known reference comes from the Handbook of Prescriptions for Emergencies by Guohong in the 4th century CE, where he detailed how to prepare the plant to alleviate fever symptoms. Qinghao was not framed as an exotic discovery, but as part of a broader, sophisticated system of traditional Chinese medicine that approached health holistically, balancing the forces of yin and yang. While Europe was still in the grip of recurring malarial epidemics in the Middle Ages, Chinese physicians were already refining ways to use qinghao effectively. This plant would eventually yield artemisinin, the compound that, in the 20th century, became the foundation of modern anti-malarial treatment. But for centuries, it remained outside the Western canon of medicine, largely because European scholars dismissed non-European systems as unscientific. The irony, of course, is that when the World Health Organization recognized artemisinin as a breakthrough drug in the 1970s, it was celebrated as a triumph of modern medicine rather than a rediscovery of ancient Chinese knowledge. Africa, too, had its arsenal of anti-malarial plants long before European intrusion. Indigenous healers across West and Central Africa used a wide variety of herbs, roots, and barks to treat malaria-like fevers. For example, the bark of Cryptolepis sanguinolenta, known locally in Ghana and Nigeria, had potent anti-malarial properties that communities relied upon for generations. Ethnobotanical studies in recent decades have confirmed that this plant contains alkaloids capable of fighting the malaria parasite, validating what traditional healers had long understood. Yet for centuries, these remedies were dismissed as mere superstition, only to be revisited later by pharmaceutical companies searching for new drugs. The suppression of indigenous medical knowledge was not simply a matter of ignorance. It was a deliberate act tied to colonial domination. European colonizers understood that controlling knowledge was as important as controlling land and labor. By dismissing indigenous healing practices as primitive, they legitimized the imposition of European medical authority. Missionaries, colonial doctors, and administrators often banned or restricted the use of local remedies, forcing communities to rely on imported European medicines that were costly and sometimes less effective. In this way, medicine became a tool of dependency and control. Yet despite this suppression, indigenous knowledge systems proved remarkably resilient. In many regions, traditional healers continued to practice quietly, passing down their wisdom through oral tradition, ritual, and apprenticeship. Communities often turned to them when European medicine failed, particularly in rural areas where colonial hospitals and pharmacies were scarce. Far from being relics of the past, these healers remain vital to survival. The story of malaria's cure, therefore, is not one of European ingenuity alone, but of global entanglement, appropriation, and resistance. The cinchona tree of the Andes, the qinghao plant of China, and the countless anti-malarial herbs of Africa all testify to the depth and sophistication of non-European medical systems. They remind us that science and medicine have never belonged exclusively to one civilization, but have always been the shared heritage of humanity, though too often written in ways that obscure its true origins. The tragedy is that this pattern of appropriation continues even today. Pharmaceutical companies frequently patent compounds derived from plants long used by indigenous communities, without compensation or recognition for the original custodians of the knowledge. Biopiracy, as it is called, is the modern echo of colonial medicine's erasure. The story of malaria's cure is not just a chapter of the past, but a living reminder of the ongoing struggle to protect indigenous knowledge from exploitation. Revisiting this history allows us to see medicine not as a one-way story of European progress, but as a tapestry woven from many cultures, often in uneven and unjust ways. The Andean healers who first used cinchona bark, the Chinese physicians who refined qinghao, and the African herbalists who treated fevers with Cryptolepis deserve recognition as pioneers in the global fight against malaria. Their contributions saved millions of lives, even if their names were never inscribed in European medical texts. In the end, the plant that cured malaria before Europe discovered it is more than just a botanical specimen. It is a symbol of a deeper truth, that knowledge exists everywhere, nurtured by people who listen closely to the land, who learn from plants and pass their wisdom from one generation to the next. To honor that truth is to challenge the narrow histories that have long denied it, and to recognize that the future of medicine may well depend on rediscovering what was known all along.